Hey everybody, welcome to another, or maybe your first, boss kill review with Anomaly. Today we're talking about the one, the only, General Nazgrim of Mists of Pandaria fame. Of course, this was a boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar, about midpoint there in that tier, in that raid. And yeah, we're going to be going through basically the boss, a little bit of lore, a little bit of backstory. There's actually a lot to talk about old Nazgrim. And then, of course, going through the mechanics, understanding the fight a little bit. And finally, we'll wrap up, give it a score. We'll see. So, of course, to kick us off, let's go through kind of some of the lore, some of the backstory. Nazgrim is actually a very long-standing character in terms of kind of the Warcraft lore, right? He was in those internment camps with Thrall way back when, was eventually freed by the Horde, of course, and slowly sort of built his way up through the Horde army. We first sort of meet him around the Wrath of the Lich King time frame. He's sort of in Conquest Hold, I believe, lower level character. He might be a quest giver for a couple things, not really a huge influence. However, after that, through Cataclysm, he slowly gains ranks, gets some more interesting lore story, starts to become more than just a regular sort of lieutenant or legionnaire, and slowly gets ranked up, right? Eventually, at the start of Mists of Pandaria, where really we get to sort of get the full brunt of him, he becomes a general of the Horde army. Very distinctive, all through essentially a lot, or maybe not all through, but a lot of his model, is very distinctive in that red armor. But we sort of grew as players with him through Wrath of the Lich King, through Cataclysm, and then finally into Mists of Pandaria. And spoiler alert, beyond Mists of Pandaria, but we're not going to talk about that. Yep. So basically, he's sort of that original person we meet. He sort of headlines the charge, into Mists of Pandaria, or Pandaria, right? For the Horde, sort of that main general, eventually becoming really a very close ally of Garrosh, right? And the idea here is that he's not, I don't believe at the end of the day, he is a loyalist to Garrosh, right? But he is, of course, kind of bound by his duty in terms of like Garrosh is his war chief. He's gonna protect him. He's gonna follow him. So definitely much more of a duty bound type of character. And we eventually fight him in the final raid, right, in the Siege of Orgrimmar, as we are slowly closing in on sort of getting rid of old Garrosh out of the Horde, taking it back over, things like that. So here's one of the boss fights we do fight as we sort of start to get into the depths of what was happening, underneath of Orgrimmar, what Garrosh had done down there. So the fight itself is very much it's not exciting. It's not that exciting. It's very much a simple sort of ad control fight that has one kind of interesting mechanic that we'll go through, right? So again, we're going to focus, like we do with all these videos, going to focus on sort of the heroic or mythic mode, right? So I think at this point in Mists of Pandaria, heroic mode was the hardest level of content you could do. However, if mythic comes in, we'll talk about mythic, right? So the biggest thing with this fight is essentially General Nazgrim did a couple of things. First up, he summoned a various number of ads. Of course, those ads had a priority, right? You needed to kill them, things like that. He also had a rage bar and would cast abilities based on the amount of rage that he had at the time. And there was, ways to control that as players. And then also he had stances, just much like a normal warrior. He had battle stance, berserker stance, and defensive stance. So let's quickly go through number one, the stances, number two, then his abilities, and number three, the ads, and sort of throw that all together, get a strategy, and sort of how you did the fight, at least at a high level. We're not going to sort of like min-max go all the way down to the bottom, right? So basically, in terms of, stances, he had, of course, battle stance, very standard. He would generate one rage a second while in battle stance. He then had berserker stance, where he would double the amount of rage he generated from abilities, but would take 25% more damage. And then finally, defensive stance, where essentially he gained three rage every time someone attacked him, but it didn't really proc more than once a second. So essentially, if you continually attack him with your whole raid, he'd generate 3 rage every second. So those were sort of his sort of stances, and he'd flip between them. I believe it was like every 45 seconds to a minute, right? But you'd get a sort of a prompt, and his stance would change. So the other thing that we do is he had a couple of quick, just common abilities, right? Number one was Sundering Blow. That's your tank swap ability. It essentially made the tanks take, I think it was like reduce their armor. It reduced their armor by 10% per stack, so it would stack up. And every time he hit the same tank with that, he would generate 5 additional rage. So if you hit the first time, he generated 5 rage. If you got hit a second time, he generated 10 rage, etc., etc. Again, remember in Berserker Stance, that number was doubled. Keep that in mind. The other thing that he would do was just put a random bleed on the raid called Bone Cracker. Not too exciting. Also, on heroic mode, he would cast Execute on his current target, which just meant your tank needed to be topped up, potentially an external, particularly when they were taking multiple stacks. While the boss is in Berserker Stance, that damage was, of course, increased by 25%. So of his abilities, while he had rage, he had 4 different abilities he'd cast at different rage points, and he'd always try and cast the most expensive ability he can. So if he had 60 rage, he would cast his 50 rage ability, because he didn't have a 60 cast one. But if he had 80 rage, he'd cast his 70 rage ability, essentially. And he'd try and do this every 15 seconds based on his rage amount. So his first one was Heroic Shockwave. It cost 30 rage. Basically jumped at a target. There was like a X thing that popped out. You had to dodge it. Pretty simple. At 50 rage, it was a banner that would essentially all of his ads that were in the fight would generate 3 rage every time they attack. So you want to kill the banner ASAP. It lowers his rage generation. War Song, which is Wade Ride AoE damage at 70 rage. And then finally at 100 rage, he'd throw Ravagers, essentially just literally throwing a Ravager-like weapon, spun around an area, just dodge it. You get hit by it, he gets rage. Again, you see, everything generates rage for him, so he can do more rage abilities. So, I also mentioned ads. There were 5 different types of ads. They'd spawn in waves of 3. You had Iron Blades, which were just like melee ads that spun around. You'd have Assassins. They tried to kill people on Heroic. This was dangerous. Never turn your back to an Assassin. So you need slow stuns, things like that. There was Arc Weavers, which were mages. They'd cast big nukes on people. And then you had War Shaman healers. They would, of course, try and heal the boss. There was totems that they would drop. Again, you're sort of, those are your ads. And finally, you had snipers, which were like ranged hunter type ads. Ultimately, in terms of what you need to know about ads, War Shamans and Arc Weavers were the most important to kill. Assassins be below that. And then finally, Iron Blades and the snipers. The idea there is, though, since they spawned in waves of 3, some waves were harder than others. Like if you had a wave with, a shaman and an arc weaver together, sort of need some stun balancing there. If you had, a wave with just Iron Blades, like sort of just AoE cleave them, you're fine, not a big deal. And that's basically sort of around the fight. So from a strategy perspective, the way you sort of approach this is essentially it's an ad control fight, right? Every time an ad wave spawns, kill the mobs in the right way. Depending on what stance it is, make sure you maybe have an external. For Berserker Stance, a lot of teams heroism on Berserker Stance. He did take 25% more damage while also doing 25% more damage. That was sort of the best place. Sort of clear an ad wave, heroism, going into Berserker Stance, and that way you have the best chance of doing the most damage. And then finally, Defensive Stance was literally the most boring, which was do not hit the boss. Like, back up, hands off the keyboard, kill, I guess, ads that were hanging out. That's basically all you did in that area. So that's essentially the fight. Control your ads, heroism, DPS when he's in Berserker Stance. Make sure you had externals or some sort of cooldown up as a tank for that. And healers just, ultimately the biggest thing healers needed to do was watch his rage bar, see, what rage he was at. If raid wide AoE was coming, make sure you had a cooldown for it. If it wasn't, heal people that had Bone Cracker. I don't know. Generally speaking, not a whole lot going on, even from an execution perspective. And the ad waves are very scripted, so you pretty much knew exactly when the next ad wave was coming, when you have to do enough damage. You knew as he changed stances, and then based on his rage, you knew exactly what ability was coming in the next 15 seconds, which honestly, kind of a cool thing where you could kind of control what abilities came in and what didn't. But in general, sort of fell on its face, just in terms of like difficulty and it wasn't that exciting. I will say at the end, I think when he reached like 10% health, he did spawn 2 sets of ad waves immediately. So that's sort of your, hey, you got him low, ignore everything and kill him as quickly as possible, which meant if you did get a shaman wave, right? Just watch the totems, make sure he doesn't get healed. CC everything, you can do that. So that was the fight. I mean, it was, I think at the time, not that exciting of a fight, right? I think it was maybe a little bit difficult in terms of ad management, but honestly, you picked it up pretty quickly. It happened in sort of just a cave, right? It was the Ragefire Chasm was sort of the entrance down underneath of Orgrimmar, where he was the first boss before it opened up into the big caverns where, Spoils was, where Siegecrafter was, right? And eventually Garrosh. So honestly, uninspiring, kind of Molten Core-esque in terms of just the lack of any detail or features. It was a cave. I will say the one interesting thing was he did spawn with a bunch of ads right in front of him. I know a ton of teams later on, sort of trying to push DPS parses, if you know what I mean, would pull those ads with the boss, and you'd sort of blow everything up right at the start, get a bunch of damage out, and then sort of continue to do the fight as normal from there. So in general, uninspiring sort of like boss room, really uninspiring mechanics. We've had seen fights before that were like ad management fights. The rage mechanic, while interesting, didn't really change the way you did the fight, and ultimately became boring when he hit defensive stance. And really the idea was, when you're progressing, hey, don't hit the boss, you can't handle it. When you got past that, you just DPS through it because like you had enough gear, you could just push. So yeah, generally not a I wouldn't say it's a very highly rated fight. It did do some interesting things in terms of that rage mechanic, like I said, but generally not that interesting. I think the most interesting part about this was that it was Nazgrim, and you had sort of kind of grown up with him if you had played the previous expansions, sort of saw him rise through the ranks, eventually become general, and then eventually you kill him. So, but don't worry, I'll give you a hint. He comes back, so he's not really dead. He actually gets a cool spot in the future. In any event, yeah, so that's the fight. That's sort of the overview. Now, we reviewed the fight. Let's talk a little bit about the rankings. So Nazgrim, of course, being a middle tier fight, let's go through it. From an execution perspective, it's a 3 out of 10. It's honestly an ad management fight. We've seen these before. It's not that difficult. Maybe you manage externals a little bit differently. Maybe you have to make some on-the-fly sort of choices with your raid cooldowns, but honestly, it is what it is. Not very hard. From a strategy perspective, again, another 3 out of 10. The strategy here is kill the most important ad, and then kill the rest of them, and then kill the boss. And hey, when he's in defensive stance, don't touch him. So again, 3 out of 10 on the strategy side. From a key mechanics perspective, this is a 5 out of 10 for me, which is definitely a little bit higher than maybe some people said, but I think the rage mechanic specifically was very interesting. Taking sort of a basic warrior class, he has always been associated, Nazgrim has always been associated as a warrior, kind of putting that lore into one of his key mechanics. The rage mechanic was honestly pretty cool. In terms of management, you could say you want to proc a certain thing, push him, maybe get that raid wide damage because you had it, versus waiting, things like that. From a unique interactions perspective, this is a 2 out of 10. I mean, CC classes can CC harder. You never really kept an ad fully CC'd for the majority of the time. So like multiple hunters or, rooting and things like that. No, you're indoors anyway, but it wasn't a big thing. So 2 out of 10 in terms of unique interactions between classes, or even just between spells and things like that. His room really did nothing. In terms of style and look and feel, the boss area itself, like I mentioned, it's a molten core cave. Again, I gave it a 3 out of 10. It probably could be lower, but there was some cool banners. Sort of the entryway in was interesting. You sort of walk down Ragefire, and then you see the big door behind them. So there was some interesting aspects of the room, but in general, the room was a cave. You could be in any cave, and it would be interesting, right? In terms of lore, gave this guy an 8 out of 10. And I think this is probably his highest score. This is where he really carries from a category perspective. It's in the lore. His backstory is interesting. You get to sort of see him grow up, sort of see him become, just a normal soldier to like a legionnaire to eventually a general of the Horde. I thought that was very interesting. His character itself was very interesting, very much a duty-based character. He swore to protect the war chief, right? Regardless of who the war chief is, that was what he had sworn to do. So that's why we fought him. He might not have agreed on a personal level, but he never really let that show. The idea is he was, for whatever reason, loyal to the end. From a boss model perspective, I gave him a 6 out of 10. He is, of course, just a typical orc. However, his armor, red armor, is slightly unique. And that sort of red armor motif was sort of something that he carried all the way through. He also, if his 100 rage ability was Ravager, he's carrying a Ravager model for a weapon. So a nice little tie in there. But yeah, this guy, 6 out of 10. And finally, for memorability, 2 out of 10. It's a middle tier. I mean, there's a bunch of other bosses around. I mean, I think Nazgrim suffers from a couple things, right? Number one, uninteresting fight, just in general. Uninteresting boss room. He also suffers from being in the same raid as Siegecrafter and Garrosh, which, by all expectations, are very, very good boss fights, right? Just very memorable boss fights. So yeah, he definitely suffers in that area in terms of like where he's placed overall. So that gives, from a final scoring perspective, gives him a 13 out of 40 in terms of mechanics and difficulty, and a 19 out of 40 in terms of style and look and feel, for a final score of 32 out of 80. And he's the first one on the list. So if you guys made it this far, thank you very much for watching. And of course, we will be back with more boss kill reviews by Anam later. Just check them out. Bye.